Welcome to the Getting Into Good Trouble podcast, where we make it our mission to challenge, question, and inspire you to do the same. In this episode, we'll be discussing the service delivery protests going on in South Africa.
Service delivery protests are demonstrations by communities demanding better public services. They mostly happen because of lack of clean water and sanitation, frequent electricity blackouts, poorly maintained roads, overcrowded or underfunded schools and hospitals, and government corruption. They mostly occur in South Africa and regions like Zimbabwe, and they're often seen in townships and rural areas. The protests have gone back to at least 1985, and the amount of protests each year has increased. Protests often occur in election years, and protests have mostly been violent.
The government still hasn't made any plans or actions to try to solve these problems, so the people have continued to protest. In South Africa, typically during the service delivery protests, as they've been going on for many years, the government often doesn't stop the protests before they happen. Instead, they usually respond when the protests occur, sometimes trying to address the issues that led to them, like poor public service. The government may try to negotiate with the protesters or use police to control the situation, but preventing the protests from happening is not always their first action.
As many as 50 people have died over the history of the protests. Many public buildings were destroyed during the violence. These protests turned violent because of government negligence, police brutality, political manipulation, and desperation and hopelessness. For the government negligence, years of unmet promises fuel public frustration. For police brutality, excessive force often escalates tensions. Political manipulation, some protests are exploited by political groups, and desperation and hopelessness, when peaceful protests are ignored, people resort to destruction. Some of the consequences of the violent protests are, it impacts communities because of the destruction of public infrastructure and makes conditions worse. It affects the economy by business closures, job losses, and investor hesitancy. And then the human cost is injuries, deaths, arrests, and long-term trauma.
The impact of the service delivery protests in South Africa has been tremendous. Many and more remote areas have gone weeks without electricity due to the active load shedding done by Eskom, the country's biggest power supplier. Load shedding is the act of cutting whole communities and groups off from power for days at a time to try and preserve energy. Many are also without homes because of the lack of equal distribution and general scarcity of housing, and proper plumbing and water supply are equally scarce. The lack of services has caused a decline in resources, job opportunities, and an increase in overall poor living quality and condition. The protests have greatly impacted the relationship between the government and its people. Protests have led to many court case filings, and many journalists have been fired due to the protests.
So we interviewed Rick Van Wheely, who is a teacher at Mount Vernon, who went on an interim trip to South Africa last year, and here are some clips from the interview.
What are some things that you observed about African citizens while in South Africa?
The citizens of South Africa, of course, are partly, they're all South Africans. Some have a African background, so some have a colonial European background. Some have an Indian background. So there's an incredible diversity of people in South Africa. They don't call it a rainbow nation for nothing, but there's also clearly differences in social status and economic wealth between these groups. So I would say if we talk about the original native Africans, they are, unfortunately also the most the poorest of the people in Africa. So not that dissimilar to the Native Americans in the United States today.
Did you see any protesting related to public services, like people not being happy with the public services because of blackouts or other things like that?
Uh, yeah, no. I mean, we were on a school trip, and in general, you mostly visit, of course, the more touristy areas, which are often the more richer areas. We did go to Soweto in Johannesburg, the southwestern township of Johannesburg, and I do think we all experienced a bit of a culture shock of seeing what real poverty looks like, but we did not see any protest at the time.
Did you see people experiencing anything like blackouts?
No, we've heard about it, and of course read about it. The fact that for some people, certainly the electricity blackouts is causing a lot of unrest, but other things too, like the refusal or untimely collecting of waste from people. Right, the garbage is not being picked up. No good access to clean water, no schools that are not properly functioning. There's a lot of services that leave to be desired in South Africa.
Did you see anything else related to the culture that really stood out?
Culture, yeah. It's an incredible place. It has so much different cultural roots. We spend a lot of time, of course, thinking and talking about Nelson Mandela and his whole struggle for justice and being imprisoned for almost 30 years. And then from being moved from being the sort of the public enemy number one of South African apartheid regime to the next president of the country, right? Like, there's few examples where you can see somebody make such an enormous turnaround. And we visited his youth where he grew up, and had a lot of experiences of local African cultures. Yeah.
Did you see anything related to white farmers being treated poorly?
No. Once again, we moved from Cape Town, an urban area, to Johannesburg, another city, to the Kruger Park, a national park. So in our trip, we didn't have the time to, I guess we saw some Afrikaner farmers along the way while driving from Johannesburg to the Kruger Park, but did not speak to them on that level. Certainly know the stories about, who owns the land and who thinks the land belongs to them. That is a very complicated question.
Okay. Is there anything else that's super special or unique that you experienced while you were there?
Well, I think, Africa, South Africa has an important lesson for us to learn. It is one of the few places in Africa where white people colonized and settled. They established a white supremacy regime. That regime came to an end. And now South Africa is seeking to become a stable democracy with a really large diversity of people. Right, there is many different races and cultures in that country, and so the hope is, of course, that South Africa can show the world that they are. That people from different backgrounds and different races and different religions and ethnicities can come together and make their country a success. That is the deep hope. That it doesn't always go that way, it's unfortunate, but we live in a world where people are often divided by political parties and by loudmouths on the internet. So I hope South Africa finds a way to give a home to all the people that make up that country. And Nelson Mandela was really good in that, but everyone believed in him. It is up to the future leaders to finish that job, but I think it's going to be a long road, unfortunately.
Okay. Is there anything else about your experience you'd like to share?
It's a remarkable place nature-wise. They have wonderful wine, even though I wasn't allowed to taste it. I think anyone that ever gets the chance to see Cape Town, beautiful, beautiful city, and then make the trip to Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela was prisoner for a long time. That is just a lesson into what is being done to divide this world on the basis of race, and how fighters like Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King, how they literally sacrificed their lives to beat racism. And I would recommend that to any citizen of the world to go visit that prison, which is now a museum on Robben Island.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions I have for you today.
All right, you're very welcome.
Now let's cut to our discussion about the interview.
I think that his interview was very insightful. He talked a lot about how widespread this has become, how they saw it so often, and how it happened to everybody. It wasn't just a certain group that was maybe in more poverty. It was everybody in the whole community.
Yeah, he talked about how he saw a lot of poor people, like people in poverty, like everywhere he went. And I feel like that like really connects to like our topic and like what we're talking about.
I feel like something that the government could do would to just try and be more open about what are their plans for fixing this, what are some ways that they could help the people, what are ways that they could deliver on some of their promises, some of the things that have just been broken with because of all this distrust, all this scared and anxious feeling about whether or not you're going to have clean water tomorrow, whether or not the lights are going to go off. Just creates such a sense of fear.
Yeah, it's interesting that they didn't run into any protests at all. I thought they might have not really run into them, but seen them when they were going to their next place.
He also mentioned that the government clearly didn't provide a good sanitation service because there was trash lining the streets, which also caused their water to not be as clean. Thank you for listening to the Getting Into Good Trouble podcast, where we discuss the protests currently going on in South Africa. If you want to see where we got our information and our research, look down below at our show notes.